initiative from Professor Aaditeshwar. Professor Adi is from the Department of Computer Science and Engineering at IIT Delhi, where he runs the Appropriate Computing Technologies for Development Research Group.
Great. Thanks. Yeah, this works great. I'm very excited to be here, folks. It's my first time to a FOSS conference. And I've been loving all the talks. Really great work, all of you. Great. So let me talk about this new project that we've been working on for a couple of years. Yeah. And as you can see, it's with a large network of people. So what do we do? So first of all, a lot of it is about how do we use computer science to make an real impact on the ground. The first step over here is really to understand, right, what are the problems that we're trying to solve, right? And here, all this problem discovery really happens from the community. So we spend a lot of time in the field, doing forest walks and things like that. And this is where we start discovering, right, what are the kind of problems that communities are troubled with, or when they're trying to do environment planning, natural resource management planning, what are the kind of questions that they're facing. Yeah. So for example, right, this is a unlined farm pond, which means that when water collects over here from the rain, it percolates into the ground and it enriches all the soil moisture. But this is a lined farm pond, which has a very different purpose. Here you pump water from the ground and you store it. So this one is really good for rain-fed agriculture, but this one also leads to groundwater depletion, right? And it's more used in more commercialization of agriculture. How many of these can the landscape support, right? What's the carrying capacity? Those are the kind of questions that come up, right? Likewise, right, so landscapes like this where there's forests and there's farms in the foothills, these are awesome because the runoff, when rain falls and the runoff flows into the farms, that's very nutrient rich. A lot of soil organic carbon and other things come from here. And likewise, right, in different kinds of terrain, there are different traditional water structures that have been there. But now, because groundwater and such things are more easily available, many of these traditional systems are not being maintained. So all these channels are blocked and so on. So how do you figure out, right? How do you, in some sense, debug the landscape? Um, and then of course there's more socio-economic things, right? People want to move out from the villages, they want to get an exciting life, they have aspirations, but how do you manage all of those things, right? So that's really what the core stack is meant for, that how do we build tools and systems and use data and everything, put those in the hands of the community, right? So that they can really think about what kind of destinies they want to pursue for themselves. Yeah. And now the challenges, right? So when we think about a landscape, what are the challenges over here? Now this, of course, right, all of us understand, right, that we have been living in a very interconnected web where water, soil, biodiversity, all these things, right, have feedback loops with each other. And we have royally, totally messed it all up. And what are some of the big issues, right, because of which actually the fault lines are very common. Yeah, there's a disconnect between individual good and common good, a lot of, right, desire to move fast, and so on. um, so through all of these field immersions and everything, we found that there are three things that we really need to work on where technology can play a role, right? So one is around making sure that marginalized groups, right? Why do people, why is there so much focus on individual good? Yeah. Um, a lot of it is because of stemming from inequality. And why is there so much inequality? Why isn't it not going away, even though we have affirmative action and so many things, right? It's largely because the power structures are still very imbalanced. And right, so how do we make sure that some of these structures like farm ponds and other things, right, that marginalized groups are demanding, that lower caste communities, tribal communities are demanding, they actually get those? Because unfortunately what happens is that there is a lot of elite capture, corruption, larger farmers and that communities, right, which are more politically connected, they end up getting many of these benefits. So there's a lot of need for making systems that when such communities are demanding such structures, and government schemes are meant to support that. Yeah, the government schemes are also structured to work in this bottom up manner, right? But many of these things, go haywire. So right, so we need systems that can technology that can improve transparency, right? Keep maintain accountability. Then also use science and data and so on, to so that the planning is more informed, right? It's more technically and scientific hydrologically sound, right? Like for example, how much groundwater pumping can a particular landscape support, right? So those things can be determined through different hydrological modelings and so on. Yeah. And finally, the communities also need to have some sort of a collectivization happening, right? So that everybody has a shared understanding and they can align that, how much of sugarcane can be planted in a particular area, right? For example, right? So that, right, just getting everyone to come on the same page, right? This is again one of the places where we think data can help, right? Where if communities see visualizations, they sit together and they discuss some of these things, right? They see this is what's happening in our village, what's happening in the neighboring village, right? They can contrast and compare these things. That's where again we feel that this a wider perspective can be built, right? So that's really the background, right? Now, how are we going about solving all of it? So we're building this core stack, which we view as a digital public infrastructure, and we are doing it at a bunch of different layers. Yeah. So at the base, for any landscape, we are bringing a lot of these different data sets together. How is land use and land cover changing over time? Which areas are getting deforested? Where is forest canopy cover reducing? Yeah. So a lot of these models now, this is where the science comes in. um, Researchers have built these things. Many of my own students have been working on such things as part of their PhD and master's research. So they build these models, and then we take them and we're using them in the core stack. Yeah. So how do we use machine learning on satellite data and different kinds of hydrological modeling and so on, climate models, climate projections, to get all this data together? Yeah. On that, we can then compute analytics, right? That for a given spatial unit, like a village or a panchayat, we are able to compute a lot of these different indicators, yeah, of how things are changing. And just for perspective, right? When we started this work, we did we tried to understand, right, how many such indicators are relevant when it comes to describing a landscape, because you need to understand how is agriculture changing, how is biodiversity changing, surface water, groundwater, forest, right? So many things. So we went to a whole bunch of like different areas, right, from Rajasthan to Odisha, Jharkhand, Bihar, Raichur, and overall we built a set of, again, it's not complete, but 81 sort of broad variables. Out of those 81, over 2 years, we've just been able to, with a lot of hard work and a large team that we've been working with of students and computer scientists, we've hardly gotten to about 22. Yeah. So there's a long gap. And that is really where I hope many of you can also come together and join us in this. Yeah. Because you need all that complexity to be able to really understand and figure out, right, what are the trade-offs, right? You increase one thing, how does it start affecting something else? Yeah. And then I'll show some of these tools, right? So of course all of these are also accessible as APIs and everything. So if, for example, anyone wants to build an app where they want to use all these data sets, that's of course there, but we're also building tools on top of it. So I'll show this Know Your Landscape tool very quickly. This tool is meant more for, right, that in a landscape, let's say, uh, an NGO that wants to do some planning. Yeah. So you select a state, district, tehsil, and for this area, we've built automated pipelines. So that pre-compute, it takes us about a day for one tehsil to compute a whole range of these data sets. Yeah. So what you see here is basically these blue boundaries are what are called micro watershed boundaries. This is about 1,000 hectares. So micro watershed is like a saucer, right? It's got edges on one side, and so whatever rain that falls in the saucer stays over here. It's a bit more complex. It's got one outlet and so on, right? But these are hydrology units that are good for many of these kinds of analysis. Yeah. So what we've done is that um, for these micro watersheds, right now, if you want to say, show me micro watersheds which are mostly plain or which are a mix of plains and slopes. So what's happening is that at the back, our pipelines ran a terrain computation algorithm, yeah, which uses digital elevation maps. Digital elevation maps tell you that for each pixel, what is the height of the pixel above sea level. On that, we run some algorithms to say, right, which pixels are at the top of at the bottom of a V-shaped valley, or is it a U-shaped valley, or a flat mountaintop and so on, right? Because all of these different landforms, right, have different ecologies, that ecosystems that will come up, right? So right, and then this is just a very simple simplification, right? A simple discretization. These areas are mostly yellow, mostly plain, or these areas have a mix of plain and slopes, right? And along with this, then we've got right, we pulled in rainfall data, runoff, right? So now if you want to see which areas are more drought prone, right, you can do that. Yeah. Then likewise, if right, we identify water bodies remotely, and then for these water bodies we say which of these water bodies, how much of them have water throughout the year, how much of them have water only during the monsoons. Yeah. So for example, this is a dam, which where you can see it a bit more clearly, right? That some part of the dam has water throughout the year. This one has water during monsoon and post monsoon. This one only has water during the monsoons, right? So these are, some of the things, and essentially what this then helps us do is that now, in a tehsil is or a sub district or a block is a good unit, because this is where a lot of planning for government schemes happen, right? And here NGOs are trying to build what are called multi-actor platforms, that they bring in people, NGOs working in different parts, and they also bring in somebody from the forest department, somebody from the agriculture department, somebody from the rural development department, and now they can use this to basically see that, okay, now in these areas which are mostly plain and drought prone, and there is a lot of surface water stress, what kind of program should we do? Yeah. So it's very good for that kind of a planning. And likewise, these are detailed reports that for this micro watershed, these reports are generated automatically. That what's the terrain like, some statistics that how much area is plain or how much area is on ridges, what's the land use like, how much area has crops or trees, yeah. Where has there been reduction in tree cover, right? Tree cover which has turned into built up or which has turned into barren, right? So all of these pipelines that we have, similarly cropping intensity, right? Which areas are only able to plant one crop in a year or two crops, right? Is cropping increasing? So all of these pipelines that we have, we generate the outputs year on year, yeah, and then each year we keep refreshing, yeah. So now in one shot, right? Similarly, surface water, right? Rainfall, runoff, evapotranspiration, groundwater, drought occurrences, yeah. Which villages intersect with this micro watershed, was the population like? So all of these things are pulled in from different sources, right? This gets pulled in from the census. These things get scraped from the government's Narega website and so on, right? But again, my broader point is that these are still, just 22 out of those 81, right? There's a lot more that we need. Um, so right, so now one of the things, right, why are we doing all this, right? Because the cool thing is that once you're computationalizing these units, right, now, right, we are in a position that we can start writing these kind of expressions, right? Just logical expressions that in areas where the aquifer is hard rock and the terrain is a mix of plain and slopes and groundwater is steady and double cropping is in some range, right? What should be done? Yeah. And here also the idea is not to use experts to like write out these patterns, right? But local NGOs and the communities in these areas, they know what works, right? They know how much, capacity the landscape can sustain. So essentially, this can become a way of codifying their local ecological knowledge. Yeah. So that's one of the other directions that we're moving in. That based on, and here we're also using LLMs, right? So we basically ingested some about 600 NGO reports of different interventions they had done in different areas, and then for those areas, we brought in all of these different variables, and then now we're trying to combine them together, right? That the kind of problems that the LLMs identified, observable symptoms reported by the NGOs, what kind of expressions do they correspond to? So we're trying to do something called symbolic regression, right? Um, and right now, behind this, there's of course, a lot of very interesting computer science to be done, very interesting things that we can borrow from ecologists. Pradeep was talking about some of that, right? Can we also pull in state of the birds information over here, right? So those are things that we should really think about. So there are some cool algorithms, right? Not very complex, right? Like for terrain, um, it basically sees whether a pixel, right, in its local neighborhood, is it at the top or not, or in a wider neighborhood, where is it, right? So that just helps in this classification. Similarly, for cropping, we use time series of satellite data. Now, the satellites and all this is open data. The satellites revisit the same spot every 5 days. Yeah. So basically, over a year, you can actually build a whole time series of spectral data: red, green, blue, near infrared, shortwave infrared, thermal, lot of such bands, right? And you can then do some simple things, right? You write it as a time series, you then do peak detection in the time series, and you count the number of peaks. So if in a area you're mostly seeing one peak, it's mostly single cropping. If you're seeing two peaks, right, there's probably two crops being grown. You're seeing three peaks, it's three crops being grown, or maybe it's a perennial or an annual crop, right? So basically, behind all this, there are we've written all these pipelines, right, for groundwater, and lots of interesting things. That how does water flow, right, from one micro watershed? What is the connectivity graph? You can do all this kind of stuff. Essentially, right, you're computationalizing the whole landscape, yeah, and everything in it, right? Water bodies, plantations, farms, right? Ultimately, these are all objects in a landscape, and you're sort of understanding how the landscape is evolving over time. Yeah. So yeah, then so this Noya landscape is more, like I showed, it's more for this broad area level planning. Now, once this area level planning is done, and you kind of know what you want to do in an area, we've also built an app called Commons Connect, which is now in the hands of somebody on the ground, like a community volunteer from that area, or an NGO frontline field worker. This actually then allows them to exactly start geotagging, right? That I want to do a farm pond at this point, or a check dam at this point. Yeah. And here, again, there are different hydrological models that we can do. That is this actually a good site for a farm pond? Yeah. If a farm pond were done over here, yeah, what will the storage look like? Yeah, for where, how, where, by when is it expected to fill up, and by when, for how long will it stay filled up? Yeah. So these are, other models that can help in decision support. And what this gives ultimately is that after this planning has been done in a village, you can generate what's called a detailed project report. This is now a standard document which can be given to the Gram Sabha. From there, it goes to the panchayats. From there, it goes into Narega, which is this government scheme that funds many of these assets, right? So this is what brings in the social accountability and transparency as well. Because now in this DPR, we are actually saying that this community has wants this structure, and we're also attaching a score with it, that this is actually the right location for this structure. If a structure were to be built, it will have these kind of benefits, this kind of water availability, and so on. Then it becomes very difficult for anybody to deny. Yeah. And that is the whole part about adding transparency and social accountability that I was talking about. Yeah. So there's a lot of, right, very cool modeling stuff that can be done. I'm not going through the details, right? And again, these are landscapes, these are, right, complex systems with a lot of feedback loops, right? So if you, right, create more and more unlined farm ponds, right, ultimately it leads to groundwater depletion, which then reduces their impact on drought, makes areas more vulnerable to drought, right? So it's quite complex, right? And right, there's no end to the research, and the whole idea is that how do we get this research to deployment, right? So there's, right, more detailed complex modeling that can be done, that right, based on all of these different variables. um, how much can we forecast that if we do these kind of interventions, is the resilience of this landscape going to improve or not? Yeah. And here we're mostly looking at agriculture, but now you can start imagining, right? You also add a forest model over here, and you start thinking about climate projections, and you start saying that, well, if this forest were to change into some other kind of a forest, then what will be the impact? Yeah, and so on. So there's tons and tons of cool stuff that can be done. um, Finally, we're also building impact assessment, that if, these things were done, farm ponds and so on, what impact have they had? Yeah. So again, some cool stuff, that's right. So the way we do it is that for any farm pond, we look at how the greenness around the farm pond is changing after the intervention year, compared to before the intervention here? So what's the difference? And how does it compare to counterfactual locations? Yeah, meaning areas where there is no farm pond but which are very similar to this site. Yeah, in terms of soil, in terms of slope, and distance to other water bodies and so on. So these are standard methods to attribute, right? Causal methods to say that the whatever impact we are seeing is actually because of the farm pond. Yeah. So now another right cool stuff that computing all these layers, there are dependencies, right? So you start with some data sets on which you run some algorithms that produces some output, on which you run some other algorithm which produces some output, and so on. Yeah. And this we do location by location. And this is also then now to maintain all of it, we are actually moving to using Airflow, where we will represent everything as a DAG, a directed acyclic graph. And then what we can do basically is that if, let's say, we improve this ML model over here, yeah, then what we want is that everything downstream of it can be automatically recomputed, but it doesn't need to touch any of the other stuff. Yeah. So all dependencies can be then done, right? So we are building these primitives that if you update an algorithm, then, or if you update a data set, or if you augment the DAG, you add more stuff to it, right? And then for any data set, you can get the lineage, right? Where did it come from, and so on. Likewise, there's many efficiency improvements. We saw some nice talks, right, about using QPy, and we need exactly those kinds of things because some of these things are actually very compute intensive. So we are also making GPU versions of some of the algorithms. Yeah. Very quickly, right now, while right, so the title that I try to put, right, we saw how we go from community needs to pixels, right, from people to pixels, building stuff, but and we're taking it back to the community. And here now the whole idea is that we want it to be very community based, that they are the ones who should be able to do this planning. That's the tools are meant for them. Yeah. So they are the ones who should, and they understand their landscape. They're stewards of their landscapes, right? And these can then be funded through schemes like Narega or even through carbon credits, right? But how do we fund these stewards, right? So this is where we are also trying to conceive of a model where some fraction of this, yeah, can pay for a reasonable income for these community stewards, right? Because otherwise it is very difficult to retain, right, talent in villages, and talent, right, which can do this kind of technical stuff. So so we're also we've not started on this as yet. This is just theoretical, but we think it can be done. And what this can really enable is, right, so our goal is that can we have 25,000 such stewards across India, one per panchayat, right, that we want to work in, who can do all this. Yeah. um, so I'll without going into these things, let me just show you, right, that what we're really eager for you guys to help is right. So there's a whole bunch of different things, right? So there's a long list of layers, data sets, right, from agriculture to hydrology, right, and so on, right? These are all things that there's links to papers, right? So many of these papers we want to implement them as pipelines. So we've put up detailed guides on how these pipelines can be built, and we want to have more and more people get interested to work on this. Um, um, uh, there's a detailed technical manual that we have which outlines, right, all the different data sets that we have so far on forest welfare, right, different algorithms. There's also APIs that right, so any of these data sets for a given lat long, you can get the micro watershed. For that, you can get the entire time series like rainfall or other time series. So all these APIs are there. You can embed these maps in your apps or bots or anything, right? Query them through agents. Yeah. So we're really looking forward for more collaboration, more people to join in this effort, which brings strong science of from ecology and hydrology environment of how it should be done, and put it into strong computer science tools, and which can then be taken to the communities. Yeah. I probably went on for too long. Maybe not much time for questions, but yeah. 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 Yeah, that's exactly how it is. Yeah. So actually, it's a whole ecosystem that go includes right NGOs at this stage, where they help in problem discovery, field testing, piloting, implementation, and finally taking it to scale up. Who have to right? That's where we get the problems, right? What to solve, and they are the ones who also take it to the ground, right? Where are we sitting in? We are partly sitting on the science side of building these methods, and then partly on the software engineering side of writing the code and everything for it. Yeah, but that's exactly the whole idea, right? Work with partners, NGOs who are on the ground and who can basically build this army of landscape stewards. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, great. So I'll do